The European Reformation transformed the face of Western Christendom. Gone was the unity of the church that had existed for over 1,000 years. And what would replace it during the 16th century was a fragmentation of religion. People separated by practice, belief, and doctrine. Churches would emerge that were under the control of temporal rulers. And from Scotland in the north to Hungary and Poland in the east, we saw the emergence of vernacular religious cultures that were highly distinctive, yet quite separate from one another in terms of belief and of practice and of order. What the Reformation also brought was violence, disorder, and war. The person at the beginning of this movement, who towers over all of it, is Martin Luther. Martin Luther came from an remarkably unremarkable life. Yet that life would shape what was to come in the decades and centuries ahead. Born in 1483 in Eisleben to Hans Luther and his wife Margaret, Luther came from a small town and was the son of a man involved in the mining world who had great aspirations for his family, a figure of his generation. And he had great hopes for his son, who was his eldest surviving son. And though the young Luther was relatively well educated, sent to schools in Mansfeld and later in 1497 to Magdeburg, where he came under the influence of the Brethren of the Common Life, a late medieval religious movement that emphasized the interiority of religion, inward spiritual development. It was at this point Martin's own spiritual disposition began to show, that he was a man who was deeply reflective, or one should say a boy, who was deeply reflective on the nature of God and salvation. And that would dominate the story that was to come. After his young education, he moved to Erfurt. His father hoped that he would study law, and in fact that was Martin's intention. But it didn't last very long. Martin soon gave up the study of law to take a bachelor's degree and then in 1505 a master's degree. What was the world into which Martin Luther was born? His birthplace was in the eastern part of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire, in the land of Saxony. The Holy Roman Empire was not Germany. It was not a unified nation, but rather a loose collection of city-states, territorial princedoms, and also ecclesiastical lands, nominally ruled over by a Holy Roman Emperor who was elected. There were within the empire 7 electors who were charged with choosing the emperor. But since the 15th century, the emperor's position had been held by a member of the Habsburg family. The great figure of this age was Maximilian I, the German emperor, who worked to have his grandson elected as his successor, which he would be as Charles V. This story of the election of Charles V plays a major part in Luther's rise and of the development of the Reformation, and we shall return to it shortly. After his studies in Erfurt, in 1505, while traveling along a road, Luther has a profound spiritual experience that would shape his life. In the midst of a thunderstorm and lightning, he is in terror struck down by the roadside and says to St. Anne, if he survives, he will become a monk. And indeed, he acts on that. He returns to Erfurt to enter the very strict Augustinian order. This was very much against the desires of his parents. Luther was determined to become the best monk he could be, to serve God by a rigorous adherence to the life of the Augustinian order. It was through this he hoped that he would find the peace that he'd been searching for. Luther's experience led him to be ordained a priest in 1507. But such was his reverence for God and such was his sense of awe that when he first celebrated the Mass, he said by his own description that his hands shook, that he was terrified. Luther had the great good fortune to fall under the mentorship of one of the extraordinary figures of the age, a gentle, learned, yet extraordinarily wise man, Johann von Staupitz. Staupitz took in hand this young, complicated, earnest, in some ways deeply troubled individual who was searching for the peace of God. He took him in hand and realized that being in the monastery, he should be encouraged to do something else. He encouraged Luther first to go to Rome in 1510 and 1511, where Luther went on the business of his order. While in Rome, Luther was transformed. He was shocked and horrified by what he saw, this venality of religion, the venality of the church. He returned by long travels to Erfurt, and there Staupitz encouraged him to go to Wittenberg. Wittenberg, in the east, was a new university founded only in 1502. And in 1512, Luther completed his doctorate at the university. He had a doctorate in the study of Scripture. And he took up a position teaching Scripture in the University of Wittenberg, a place he would remain for the rest of his life. Wittenberg was a relatively obscure place in the Holy Roman Empire. Located here in the east, it was far from the major centers, the major cities in the east of Augsburg, Nuremberg, Basel in the south. Yet, over the next decades, Luther would transform Wittenberg into the very heart of the Reformation. He would make it a place where students from across Europe would flock to study with him and Luther's very close friend, Philip Melanchthon. During the period after 1512, Luther began to lecture on the Bible regularly, going through twice the Psalms and the letters of St. Paul. And there his thinking began to take shape. He began to reflect on the righteousness of God, on the sinfulness of humanity. And he began to pose questions about how is it that humans are saved. In particular, one might draw attention to his lectures on Galatians in 1516, 1517, those fateful years. For it was in 1517 that Luther became aware of priests, Dominicans mostly, who were selling indulgences in nearby lands. The great ecclesiastical figure Albrecht of Mainz had sanctioned the sale of indulgences, both to raise money for his own debts and for the building of St. Peter's in Rome. Indulgences are extremely controversial because they are often reduced to something far cruder than they were intended to be. But Luther saw this as a pastoral problem, that indulgences were ways in which people could pay money to receive pieces of parchment which guaranteed intercession for their beloved who were in purgatory. This was part of the late medieval world whereby the living interceded for the dead. The dead were in purgatory and dependent on the good works and prayers of the living. That the penitential works of the living were of benefit to those dearly departed. Luther saw this as a problem whereby, by the giving of money, people were not doing the spiritual exercises that was required of them. They were not doing proper penance. They were not seeking the forgiveness of God. They were trying to, or they were being promised, which was the worst part, they were being promised by the church that they could have something in return for their money. They were being fleeced. It was at that point Luther decided that he would stage, or at least participate, in an academic debate. That academic debate would be based upon 95 theses, which he drew up in Latin, and had posted. The traditional story is that he nailed them to the door himself. It is more likely that he had someone from the university post them, to launch an academic debate that was not to be a popular movement, but was to be within the university. However, these 95 theses were quickly translated into German, printed, and disseminated across the German lands, creating a sensation. The name Martin Luther suddenly became known, and a revolution had begun.